He was a cardinal's son who traded his robe for a sword, a man whose sheer ruthlessness became the gold standard for tyrannical power. This is the story of Cesare Borgia, the bloody Renaissance figure whose cruelty so terrified Machiavelli that he became the ultimate blueprint for the prince. Cesare Borgia was not born into a world of simple inheritance or straightforward ambition. He entered the Renaissance stage as the notorious son of Pope Alexander VI, a man whose papal authority gave him wealth, influence, and, most importantly, protection in a world governed by both church and sword. Unlike most men of his time, Cesare rejected a conventional clerical path. He abandoned his position as a cardinal, renouncing the religious garb that marked him as a man of the church, and chose instead to carve his place in the chaotic, violent world of Italian politics. From the very beginning, his goal was clear: to create his own independent state, a domain where his rule would be absolute, unquestioned, and enforced with whatever means necessary. Caesar's methods were as brutal as they were calculated. In a landscape riddled with rival city-states, shifting alliances, and mercenary armies, a man could survive by being clever, ruthless, or lucky, or all three. Cesare had no interest in luck. He relied on cunning and unflinching cruelty to achieve his ends. His campaigns in central Italy were relentless, showing no hesitation when it came to punishing dissent or eliminating obstacles. Cities that resisted him faced sieges, executions, and public demonstrations of terror. But Cesare was not simply a brute, he was a strategist, someone who understood the psychological machinery of power. Violence for him was a tool, not a spectacle. Each act of brutality was carefully calibrated to intimidate opponents, to consolidate loyalty, and to establish a reputation that preceded him. The mere rumor of Caesar's ruthlessness often achieved what an army could not, convincing enemies to capitulate without a fight. One of the most infamous examples of his strategic cruelty was the murder of his own military captain, Ramiro de Lorca. De Lorca had successfully restored order to Romania under Caesar's command, using methods that were extreme, even by the standards of the day. Instead of praising him, Cesare turned on him. He publicly executed de Lorca in the town square, presenting it as justice for excesses that had already served Caesar's own ends. This act was brilliant in its cruel simplicity. Cesare eliminated a potential rival, appeased the local populace by placing blame for prior atrocities on de Lorca, and simultaneously reinforced the principle that loyalty was conditional and failure, or even perceived disloyalty, would not be tolerated. Here, cruelty became a calculated mechanism for control, a weapon to maintain power in a fractured and treacherous landscape. Caesar's cunning did not end with his subordinates. He also mastered the art of betrayal in the pursuit of political consolidation. The massacre of Senigallia in 1502 remains one of his most chilling displays of strategic ruthlessness. Four rebellious generals who were secretly conspiring against him were invited to what they believed was a meeting of reconciliation. Caesar's forces arrested them immediately and executed them without ceremony, under a banner of supposed trust. The act was a masterclass in deception and psychological warfare. By luring his enemies into a trap under the guise of diplomacy, Cesare demonstrated that betrayal, when executed decisively, could be more effective than prolonged conflict. Machiavelli later praised this kind of ruthless precision as the ideal of political action, where fear and respect could be engineered through calculated terror. The source of Caesar's power was as practical as it was political. His campaigns and the brief period of dominance he enjoyed were financed almost entirely by the wealth and influence of his father, Pope Alexander VI. Papal gold and the machinery of the Vatican provided him with troops, resources, and diplomatic cover, allowing Cesare to project power that far exceeded what his own lands or birthright could sustain. However, this dependence was also his Achilles heel. When Pope Alexander VI died in 1503, the foundation of Caesar's empire crumbled almost instantly. Without papal support, he lost access to funds, troops, and the protective legitimacy that the church offered. What remained of his domain quickly disintegrated as enemies, both foreign and domestic, moved to reclaim power. Cesare's meteoric rise and rapid fall illustrate the fragile nature of authority that depends on external institutions rather than intrinsic power and loyal networks. Even a man of Caesar's intellect and ruthlessness was vulnerable to the cunning of others. After his father's death, Cesare made what would become his fatal error, trusting the newly elected Pope Julius II. Initially, Cesare had supported Julius, in exchange for promises of continued political support. But as soon as Julius secured the papacy, he moved decisively to eliminate Caesar's influence, stripping him of titles, territory, and eventually imprisoning him. This episode demonstrates a critical lesson in Renaissance power politics. No amount of cruelty or cunning could substitute for political foresight when confronting a rival who was equally ruthless and more strategically positioned. Even Caesar, who had mastered the art of fear and manipulation, could not survive the sudden loss of protection combined with the betrayal of trust. Cesare Borgia's life is a testament to the fusion of intelligence, cruelty, and political ambition. His actions shaped the landscape of central Italy, terrified his contemporaries, and inspired Machiavelli's seminal writings on power. Yet his career also illustrates the limits of such strategies. Without a sustainable source of power, and in the absence of loyal institutional support, even the most ruthless man can fall victim to the shifting tides of politics and fortune. Caesar's story is not merely one of brutality. It is a cautionary tale about the dangers of over-reliance on personal cunning, the instrumental use of terror, and the fragility of power built on external dependency. Cesare Borgia remains a historical figure whose name is synonymous with ambition, cruelty, and political brilliance. From executing his own general to orchestrating the massacre of Senigallia, he leveraged fear as a tool and established a model of power that has fascinated scholars and historians for centuries. For Machiavelli, he was the embodiment of what a prince could achieve when unbound by conventional morality. A living demonstration that political efficiency often demands actions that, in a less ruthless world, would be considered unforgivable. If you want to dive deeper into the bloody brilliance of historical power players and see how ambition, ego, and cruelty shaped the past, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian, where we uncover the dumb decisions, extreme egos, and catastrophic mistakes that have shaped world history. Cesare Borgia's reputation for ruthless brilliance was not built merely on battlefield victories or clever political alliances. It was forged in acts of calculated cruelty designed to consolidate power and manipulate perception. Nowhere is this more clearly demonstrated than in the infamous execution of his own military captain, Ramiro de Lorca. To understand this event, we need to place it in the context of Cesare's campaigns in central Italy and the intricate web of loyalty, fear, and political theater he expertly manipulated. At the turn of the 16th century, Cesare Borgia was expanding his control over Romagna, a region of strategically important cities and fortresses that had long resisted centralized authority. The area was volatile, populated by rebellious nobles, mercenary factions, and local militias that answered only to their own interests. Caesar's goal was to bring these territories under his personal command, creating a stable, centralized domain that could withstand both internal insurrections and external threats. To achieve this, he relied heavily on military commanders, experienced men who could enforce his rule with precision and, when necessary, brutality. Ramiro de Lorca was one such commander, a capable and loyal officer who had proven his skill in quelling uprisings and intimidating the local population. De Lorca's methods, however, were extreme even by the harsh standards of Renaissance warfare. He restored order to Romagna with measures that included mass executions, public punishments, and a level of terror designed to ensure compliance. While effective in establishing control, these actions created a delicate problem for Cesare. On one hand, de Lorca's brutality had done the job. The cities were subdued, and the populations cowed. On the other hand, the excessive cruelty could backfire politically, tarnishing Caesar's image and potentially inspiring resentment or rebellion against him personally. Cesare understood that perception mattered as much as control. A ruler's authority depended not just on the ability to enforce power, but also on the narrative surrounding it. This is where Caesare's genius for psychological manipulation and political theater came into play. Rather than limit de Lorca's authority or quietly remove him, Cesare orchestrated a public spectacle that would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. De Lorca was arrested, tried, and executed in the town square, a place where the entire community could witness the consequences of failing to align with Cesare's expectations. By punishing de Lorca publicly, Cesare achieved a masterstroke of political strategy. He eliminated a potentially rival figure who wielded considerable influence. He reassured the local population, that justice had been served, and he rewrote the narrative of the prior atrocities. The brutal acts committed during Dallorca's tenure were now framed as his own excesses, absolving Cesare of direct responsibility while reinforcing his image as a ruler who upheld order and justice, even through ruthless means. This maneuver illustrates a key principle of Cesare's approach to power. Cruelty was not senseless or chaotic. Every act of violence, every execution, was carefully calculated to reinforce hierarchy, instill fear, and manipulate perception. The execution of Dallorca sent a clear message to both the populace and Cesare's subordinates. Loyalty was non-negotiable. But even a loyal servant could be sacrificed if it served the larger goal of consolidating power. The public nature of the punishment amplified its effect, creating a shared psychological experience in which fear, awe, and compliance became intertwined. Cesare understood that people are not just controlled through brute force, they are also controlled through narrative, ritual, and the spectacle of power in action. The consequences of this act extended beyond immediate political consolidation. By removing Dallorca in such a calculated manner, Cesare set a precedent for governance by fear balanced with strategic justice. Other military commanders and city officials observed the execution and understood that Cesare's wrath was both real and precise. Disobedience or failure would be met with consequences, but those consequences were deployed with logic and purpose rather than chaotic cruelty. This distinction mattered deeply. In a world of competing city-states, mercenaries, and volatile alliances, a ruler who punished unpredictably risked rebellion and chaos. Cesare's approach combined the efficiency of fear with the clarity of rational calculation, a formula that made him both respected and feared in equal measure. Moreover, the handling of Dallorca demonstrates Cesare's mastery of political optics. Renaissance Italy was a place where reputation could be as lethal as swords, where the perception of strength could deter rebellion more effectively than armies. By executing Dallorca publicly, Cesare controlled the narrative of his own rule. The population could see that excesses had been punished, which legitimized Cesare's authority in the eyes of those who might otherwise have viewed him as a tyrant. The message was multifaceted. Cesare was powerful. He was capable of enforcing order. He was merciful only in the form of calculated justice, and he was ultimately in control of both violence and morality within his territories. The episode also highlights the delicate interplay between loyalty and fear in Cesare's governance. Military commanders, like Dallorca, were essential tools for extending his authority, but their power was inherently precarious. Cesare, his ability to recognize when a subordinate had become a liability and to neutralize that threat without destabilizing his domain, was central to his political acumen. The execution of Dallorca was not a spontaneous act of vengeance. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain balance within his own power structure. By eliminating a potential rival while preserving the functional loyalty of others, Cesare ensured that his authority remained unchallenged and that his system of rule remained intact. This act also had a profound psychological effect on Cesare's contemporaries. Nobles, military officers, and city leaders observed that obedience, competence, and service to Cesare were rewarded with trust and opportunity. But any deviation in the form of overzealous execution or independent initiative could result in elimination. Cesare's governance was therefore both an incentive and a warning. It rewarded effectiveness within the bounds of loyalty, but punished autonomous ambition that threatened the hierarchical order. This combination of fear, reward, and narrative control allowed Cesare to project authority far beyond what his forces alone could accomplish. Cesare's calculated murder of Dallorca illustrates a broader pattern in his career. The use of cruelty as a tool for political engineering. Unlike other leaders who relied solely on brute force or charismatic leadership, Cesare integrated violence into a larger system of control. Every execution, siege, or act of terror served a purpose within his strategy to consolidate power, manage subordinates, and control perception. It was this systematized approach to cruelty that fascinated Machiavelli and informed his writings on statecraft, power, and the dynamics of fear in the prince. Machiavelli saw in Cesare an example of the delicate balance between cruelty and prudence. A ruler whose ruthlessness was effective because it was disciplined, rational, and directed toward clear objectives. Finally, The Dolorca episode reflects the inherent risks and limits of relying on human instruments of power. Even the most competent and loyal subordinates can become liabilities when their actions, no matter how effective, threaten the broader objectives of the ruler. Cesar recognized this reality and acted decisively. The execution was as much about the immediate political advantage as it was about long-term stability, demonstrating a level of strategic foresight that set him apart from his contemporaries. In this way, Cesar Borgia was not merely a brutal prince. He was a master strategist who understood the complex dynamics of loyalty, fear, and narrative in governance. Cesar Borgia's career of ruthless consolidation reached its peak with an act that would become infamous across Renaissance Italy, the Massacre of Senigallia in 1502. This event marked the high-water point of his cunning and demonstrated a level of political calculation that even his harshest contemporaries could not ignore. To understand its significance, we need to explore the context of rebellion, loyalty, and ambition that defined Cesar's rise, and the way he turned treachery into a masterstroke of power. By 1502, Cesare Borgia had consolidated a significant portion of Romagna under his control, but his domain was still fragile. Several of his own generals, men entrusted with key positions of authority, were plotting behind his back. These conspirators, dissatisfied with Cesar's growing power and the strict discipline he imposed, sought to carve out their own spheres of influence or even depose him entirely. In a world where loyalty was as volatile as mercenary pay, Cesare understood that these challenges could not be tolerated. Allowing rebellion to fester would have endangered not just his territories but his very life. The four generals at the center of the Senigallia plot were skilled men with local influence and military capability. If left unchecked, they could incite insurrection, undermine Caesar's authority, and potentially rally other discontented nobles or mercenary leaders to their cause. Cesare's solution was both simple in its logic and terrifying in its execution. Eliminate the threat entirely, while simultaneously sending a clear message to everyone else in his domain about the cost of betrayal. Cesare invited the rebellious generals to Senigallia under the pretense of a meeting for reconciliation. He extended a diplomatic olive branch, presenting the gathering as a chance to negotiate, forgive, and re-establish loyalty. This was not a spontaneous idea. It was a carefully crafted psychological maneuver. By lulling his targets into a false sense of security, Cesar ensured they would arrive unguarded and unprepared, fully expecting that their treason would be overlooked or at least diplomatically managed. The act of inviting them under a flag of truce was critical. It maximized the impact of their subsequent betrayal and amplified the shock value of their execution. Once the generals arrived, Caesar's plan unfolded with ruthless precision. The men were arrested immediately, without hesitation, and summarily executed. There was no trial, no opportunity for appeal, no chance for resistance. The swiftness of the action served multiple purposes. First, it neutralized the conspirators before they could act on their plans or coordinate a response. Second, it minimized the risk of open battle or urban warfare, which could have endangered Caesar's troops or the local population. Third, it created a spectacle of power, demonstrating to all who witnessed or even heard of the event that disloyalty would be punished without mercy and without delay. The psychological impact of the massacre of Senigallia was enormous. Other generals and local leaders were forced to confront a stark reality. Cesare's authority was absolute, his decisions final, and his ruthlessness effective. The event instilled fear, but it also established a form of calculated respect. Observers could see that Cesar wielded violence strategically, not randomly, and that he understood the importance of timing, perception, and control. By turning a moment of potential vulnerability into a demonstration of dominance, Cesar reinforced the stability of his rule and ensured that his remaining subordinates would act with extreme caution. This massacre also highlighted Caesar's skill in controlling narrative and optics. By framing the executions as a response to rebellion and conspiracy, Cesar shifted public perception. The generals' deaths were not acts of capricious cruelty, but a form of necessary justice. Local populations, who might have resented harsh governance, could interpret the punishment as a deterrent against lawlessness and disorder. Cesare used the event to demonstrate that he upheld order, loyalty, and hierarchy even while employing fear as a tool. The spectacle of justice served a dual function, It eliminated immediate threats and reinforced long-term stability. The massacre of Senigallia further cemented Caesar's reputation beyond Italy. Word of his calculated efficiency and decisive action spread quickly through diplomatic channels, mercenary networks, and the courts of Europe. Machiavelli, in particular, studied Caesar's methods with fascination. In The Prince, Machiavelli cites acts like Senigallia as exemplary demonstrations of how a ruler could consolidate power through a combination of calculated cruelty, strategic foresight, and psychological insight. Caesar's ability to neutralize conspiracies with precision, without losing control of his domain or alienating his subjects, was instructive for anyone seeking to understand the mechanics of power. The event also underscores the interplay between fear and loyalty in Renaissance statecraft. Caesar's leadership relied on both incentives and deterrence, and the massacre of Senigallia was the ultimate deterrent. Generals and officials learned that, while service to Caesar could bring opportunity and rewards, disloyalty would be met with immediate and uncompromising punishment. This balance of fear and calculated justice created a disciplined, though terrified, administrative and military apparatus, allowing Caesar to project authority far beyond his personal physical presence. Importantly, Caesar's execution of the rebellious generals was not merely about immediate survival, it was a strategic move designed to strengthen his political position over the long term. By removing potential rivals, he secured the loyalty of remaining subordinates and minimized the risk of fragmented resistance. The massacre also demonstrated Cesare's understanding of human psychology. Threats are most effectively neutralized when the target believes that resistance is futile and that betrayal carries absolute consequences. The event was as much a lesson in perception management as it was a military or political maneuver. The massacre of Senigallia also provides insight into the broader context of Caesar's power base. His control over Rumonia was fragile, dependent on both his military skill and his political cunning. Unlike modern states with formal institutions, Caesarea operated in a world dominated by personal loyalty, family connections, and the constant threat of revolt. In such an environment, decisive, visible acts of enforcement were essential for survival. The massacre demonstrated that Caesar not only understood this environment, but could manipulate it to his advantage, turning potential disasters into displays of strength. Finally, the event illustrates the calculated nature of Renaissance cruelty as distinct from wanton violence. Caesar's actions were targeted, deliberate, and rational, aimed at consolidating authority and deterring rebellion. Unlike chaotic or emotional acts of cruelty, the massacre of Senigallia was executed with precision, timing, and foresight. Every decision, from the invitation under a flag of truce to the swift execution, was part of a larger strategy to secure power, maintain loyalty, and control perception. It was this combination of strategic insight and ruthless execution that earned Cesare Borgia a lasting place in history as a master of political calculation and Machiavelli's model of princely power. Cesare Borgia's meteoric rise to power was inseparable from the immense wealth and political influence of his father, Pope Alexander VI. From the moment Caesar abandoned his cardinalship to pursue secular power, he relied heavily on papal resources to fund his military campaigns, secure strategic alliances, and dominate the Italian political landscape. The fortune and influence of the Borgia family were not merely incidental, they were the foundation upon which Caesar built his state, his army, and his reputation. Without the financial and political backing of the papacy, his short-lived empire would have been little more than a collection of mercenary forces and ambitious dreams. From the start, Cesare understood that money equals power. The papal coffers provided him with the ability to hire professional soldiers, pay for artillery and fortifications, and secure loyalty through patronage. In Renaissance Italy, where armies were often mercenary and loyalty was transactional, the ability to pay troops and reward allies could mean the difference between success and annihilation. Caesar's campaigns in Rumonia, a region notorious for fragmented city-states and rebellious local lords, were made possible by the steady stream of papal funding. Every fort captured, every town subdued, and every general placated required resources. And without the papal gold, Caesarea could not have maintained this level of military and administrative control. Political influence was equally important. Pope Alexander VI's position at the head of the Catholic Church allowed Caesar to maneuver through Italian politics with a degree of protection and authority few could challenge. Being the Pope's son gave him leverage over rival families, city-states, and even other military leaders. Caesar could threaten excommunication or call upon papal legates to arbitrate disputes in his favor. He used the symbolic and actual power of the Church to lend legitimacy to his actions, presenting his conquests as extensions of papal authority rather than purely personal ambition. This shield was critical in a landscape where legitimacy was often as vital as military might. Caesar also mastered the art of political intrigue, exploiting alliances, marriages, and patronage networks to consolidate power. Many of the territories he captured were brought under control, not merely through force but through careful negotiation and strategic marriages. Towns and cities were often co-opted by promises of protection, favorable trade, or alignment with the papal family. These strategies were enabled by the combination of wealth and influence his father provided. Without access to funds and papal political leverage, such maneuvers would have been impossible. Caesar's empire, though short-lived, demonstrated how resources and cunning could allow one man to dominate multiple regions of Italy almost simultaneously. However, this reliance on papal wealth and influence created an intrinsic fragility. Caesar's power was not autonomous. It depended entirely on the continued support of his father. Unlike independent monarchs or hereditary rulers, Caesar lacked an institutional foundation. His armies were loyal largely because they were paid by papal money, and his allies maintained their support because challenging him would mean confronting the Pope himself. In essence, Caesar's empire was a personal project funded and legitimized by a higher authority. The moment that authority disappeared, the foundations of his power were exposed as unstable and vulnerable. That moment came in 1503 with the sudden death of Pope Alexander VI. The papacy, once a source of immense strength, was now a vacuum of uncertainty and instability. The new pope, Julius II, had no obligation to maintain the same financial and political backing for Caesar. All the resources and protection that had sustained him were gone overnight. Mercenaries no longer had reason to remain loyal. Rival families and lords saw an opportunity to reclaim territories, and the carefully woven web of alliances began to unravel. Caesar's power, which had seemed unassailable for years, collapsed almost instantly because it had been entirely dependent on someone else's authority. This collapse highlights one of the central lessons of Caesar Borgia's career: the danger of building power on borrowed legitimacy. While wealth and influence can accelerate conquest and consolidate control, they cannot replace independent authority. Caesar had mastered strategy, cruelty, and cunning, but these skills could not compensate for the sudden loss of the institutional and financial backbone provided by his father. Within months, towns that had once been secured through force or diplomacy slipped from his grasp. Generals and soldiers abandoned him, and the fragile empire he had built disintegrated before his eyes. Furthermore, Caesar's dependence on papal support demonstrates the interplay between personal ambition and structural vulnerability in Renaissance politics. The Borgia family's rise shows how concentrated power and wealth can produce rapid expansion, but also how ephemeral such power can be without enduring institutional foundations. Caesar's state was powerful because of immediate resources, not because of sustainable governance. And his downfall illustrates the limits of personal dominance when it lacks structural resilience. Caesar's collapse also had broader implications for the Italian peninsula. His fall removed one of the most powerful and feared figures in central Italy, creating a vacuum that rival families and regional powers quickly exploited. The territories he had controlled reverted to local rulers or were absorbed by competing forces. While his career became legendary for its audacity and ruthlessness, the transitory nature of his power serves as a stark reminder that even the most formidable ambitions can be undone when they rest on external support, rather than independent strength. In analyzing Caesar's rise and fall, it is clear that his reliance on papal gold and intrigue was both his greatest advantage and his fatal weakness. The wealth and influence of Pope Alexander VI enabled him to achieve feats that no ordinary military leader could accomplish. Yet, that same dependence meant that his empire lacked durability, leaving it vulnerable to rapid collapse the moment his father died. Caesar, story exemplifies the double-edged nature of power built on patronage. It can produce remarkable success, but carries the inherent risk of sudden catastrophic failure. The massacre of Senegalia and Cesar's broader campaigns demonstrate that while cruelty, cunning, and military skill can create immediate dominance, the sustainability of power depends on independent resources and authority. Cesar Borgia's brilliance in consolidation was unmatched, but his empire's fragility offers a timeless lesson in the perils of relying too heavily on someone else's support, no matter how powerful that support may appear. In the end, the riches of the papacy were not a permanent shield, and the sudden withdrawal of that protection exposed the ephemeral nature of even the most calculated power. After the sudden death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503, Cesare Borgia faced the single most perilous moment of his entire career. All the wealth, protection, and authority he had relied upon vanished overnight, leaving him exposed in the volatile political landscape of Renaissance Italy. In the months leading up to his father's death, Cesare had cultivated alliances and manipulated rivalries to secure his control over Romania and other territories. Yet, with the papal anchor gone, his position was no longer secured by any structural force. It rested entirely on his personal reputation, military skill, and remaining loyalists. This was when he made the fatal political error that would undo everything he had built. He trusted the newly elected Pope, Julius II. Before Julius II's ascension, Cesar had actively supported his candidacy. He believed he could secure political assurances from the new pontiff that would maintain his territorial holdings and protect his interests. Cesar had the strategic mindset of a military and political genius, and he assumed that Julius II would honor the agreements he made to obtain the papacy. He relied on diplomacy, promises, and the assumption that loyalty to the papal office would translate into stability for his own power. This decision, however, was catastrophically misjudged. It revealed a blind spot in Cesar's otherwise calculating nature. He underestimated the ambition and cunning of Julius II, who harbored his own designs on central Italy. Once in power, Julius II moved decisively to neutralize Cesar. Within weeks of his election, the new pope stripped Cesar of his titles, took control of Romania, and removed the political and military authority that had been Caesar's foundation. The papal army, no longer under Borgia command, reinforced Julius II's position, and many of Caesar's former allies quickly realigned themselves to the new power. Cesar, who had spent years consolidating control and crushing rivals through calculated cruelty and strategy, found himself abandoned and politically isolated. His reliance on personal loyalty and on agreements with the papacy proved insufficient to withstand the sudden shift in institutional power. This turn of events underscores the central lesson of Cesar's downfall. Even extraordinary personal skill cannot substitute for sustainable political foundations. His empire had been built almost entirely on the resources and protection provided by his father. The moment that external support disappeared, his enemies previously subdued through force or intimidation resurfaced with renewed confidence. Cities and fortresses that had once submitted to Caesar's authority resisted without hesitation. Generals and soldiers who had served him for pay were now willing to switch allegiance as the financial and institutional incentive had evaporated. Caesar's power, while formidable on paper, was ultimately artificial, fragile, and entirely dependent on the continued presence of Pope Alexander VI. Caesar's error was compounded by the speed and decisiveness of Julius II's actions. Unlike previous rivals whom Cesare could manipulate or intimidate, Julius II had the legitimate authority of the papacy and the means to enforce his will. The new pope mobilized armies, issued edicts, and leveraged the Catholic Church's political network to undermine Cesare's influence. There was no room for negotiation or delay. Julius II's ambitions were immediate and absolute. For a man who had mastered political manipulation through fear, deception, and strategic violence, facing an opponent with both legitimate power and determination was a scenario Cesare had never fully prepared for. The consequences for Cesare were severe and immediate. He lost control of Romania, his principal territory, and with it the logistical and military resources he had spent years consolidating. Former allies turned against him, abandoning him in favor of the Pope's authority. Caesar's personal army, once the backbone of his power, dissolved under pressure, or switched sides. Even his reputation as a ruthless and unflinching leader could not protect him when confronted with the overwhelming institutional authority of the papacy. Within months, the territories he had carved out were no longer his, and his once dominant position in central Italy was completely reversed. Caesar's imprisonment followed shortly after. Julius II, recognizing both the threat and the potential symbolic power of Cesare, ensured that the former Prince of Romania could no longer challenge papal authority. Caesar was confined, first under nominal house arrest and later under more formal detention, effectively ending his career as a political and military leader. His ability to command troops, negotiate with rivals, and control cities was extinguished almost entirely by a combination of institutional power and his own misjudgment in trusting Julius II. Even a man of Caesar's strategic brilliance could not overcome the alignment of legitimate authority, political ambition, and military capability wielded against him. This episode highlights a critical aspect of political power in Renaissance Italy. Personal genius alone could achieve rapid rises, but lasting dominance required the support of stable institutions. Caesar's entire career had demonstrated a mastery of calculated cruelty, tactical precision, and ruthless manipulation. Yet, without the financial backing and political legitimacy provided by the papacy, all his accumulated power was unsustainable. Julius II's betrayal illustrated that in a world dominated by institutional authority and shifting alliances, reliance on a single patron or source of external legitimacy was a fatal vulnerability. Moreover, Cesare's trust in Julius II reveals the limitations of even the most cunning leaders when facing rivals with different types of power. Caesar excelled in scenarios where his skill, brutality, and strategic insight could dominate weaker or fragmented opponents. He could manipulate generals, terrify populations, and consolidate territories through a combination of fear and calculation. But Julius II represented a different kind of power, a legitimate institutional force coupled with strategic decisiveness. Caesar's brilliance was insufficient against an opponent whose authority was codified, whose resources were vast, and whose determination to assert control was absolute. His failure to recognize this dynamic was the single fatal political error that ended his career. In examining Cesare Borgia's final downfall, it becomes clear that his miscalculation was both personal and systemic. Personally, he overestimated the loyalty of allies and underestimated the ambitions of his new papal counterpart. Systemically, he had built his empire on external support rather than internal stability. The combination of these factors made him extraordinarily vulnerable the moment the papal lifeline disappeared. His story illustrates the precarious nature of power that is heavily dependent on a single patron, and highlights the dangers inherent in trusting rivals, even when previous alliances appear solid or mutually beneficial. Caesar's experience offers a timeless lesson in the balance between personal capability and structural dependence. One can wield brilliance, ruthlessness, and tactical genius to dominate a region. But when that power rests on external legitimacy and is not anchored in independent authority, it can collapse instantly. Cesare Borgia, once feared across Italy and admired by contemporaries like Machiavelli for his unflinching efficiency, serves as a cautionary example. A single misjudgment in trust can undo decades of calculated strategy and bloodshed. No amount of personal skill could protect him from the immediate, decisive action of a rival who controlled the institutions upon which all power ultimately depended. Even in the final stages of his life, Caesar's legend persisted not for his mistakes, but for his capacity to consolidate power so effectively, briefly commanding territories, armies, and political influence that rivaled kings. Yet the fatal error of trusting Julius II marked the definitive end of his dominance. It underscores that, in political life, the greatest threat often comes not from external enemies, but from a miscalculation of trust, particularly when dealing with rivals whose power operates in a domain beyond one's immediate control. Caesar's downfall was complete, swift, and instructive, offering an enduring historical lesson about ambition, loyalty, and the fragile foundations of power.